You knew the rules when you bought the place.
The rules are unreasonable.
And I'm not fixing it. I'm just telling you, it needs to be up to code.
You don't get to hide from this community behind a prison wall, Grant. Celeste Whitmore said it loud enough for every person standing around the HOA summer barbecue to hear, one manicured hand wrapped around a paper wine cup, while the other pointed straight at my fence like she was announcing a criminal sentence instead of complaining about cedar boards. Her son Trevor smirked beside her near the grill smoke, leaning against his spotless black F-150 with a sledgehammer resting casually over one shoulder, while thunder rolled low across Blackwater Lake behind us. The whole cul-de-sac went quiet in that uncomfortable suburban way where nobody wants to look involved, but nobody wants to miss the humiliation either. Rain clouds hung heavy over the water, dark enough to flatten the afternoon light into steel-gray reflections across the fishing docks below the ridge. Wet cedar and charcoal smoke mixed in the cold lake wind, while somebody's country playlist kept playing too quietly in the background like the soundtrack hadn't realized the mood changed. I stood at the edge of my gravel driveway holding a coffee thermos that had already gone cold 20 minutes earlier and watched Celeste smile, that polished HOA smile people use when they think public embarrassment counts as authority. That fence violates the spirit of the neighborhood, she continued, lowering her voice just enough to sound controlled. People are starting to feel uncomfortable. Trevor laughed under his breath and tapped one of the cedar panels with the hammerhead. Honestly, he said, looks like a compound. A few neighbors chuckled nervously. Nobody stepped in. Nobody ever stepped in when Celeste decided someone needed to become an example. What none of them knew yet was that 6 months later the same people standing there pretending not to stare would be paying monthly fees to stand safely behind the wall she was about to create. If you've ever dealt with somebody who smiles while threatening your property, comment below with your city and tell me where you're watching from, because this thing spiraled way past a fence dispute faster than anybody in Blackwater Cove expected. The first hit came before I even answered her. Trevor swung the sledgehammer casually into one of the cedar posts hard enough to crack the wood with a sharp pop that echoed down toward the muddy shoreline below the hill. Gasps broke out near the folding tables. Somebody muttered, "Jesus Christ." Celeste never even flinched. She took a sip of wine and looked directly at me. "Now," she said calmly, "we can either handle this cooperatively, or the board can begin enforcement Monday morning." There it was, the real threat underneath the performance. Enforcement. Liens. Fines. Hearings. Public notices. The kind of slow-pressure HOA people use because they know most homeowners panic long before lawyers ever get involved. Rain started tapping lightly against the metal roofs across the Marina Road, while fog drifted low over the lake behind the houses. I looked at the cracked cedar post for 3 full seconds before speaking. "You done?" I asked quietly. Trevor opened his mouth again, but Celeste lifted one finger slightly, stopping him without even looking. That told me everything I needed to know about who really controlled that family. "This neighborhood has standards," she said softly. "And frankly, your fence sends the wrong message." I nodded once and looked past her toward the water where 2 sheriff boats rocked gently against the docks in the rising wind. Then I noticed something else. 3 board members standing near the clubhouse windows weren't watching the argument. They were watching me, nervous, waiting, like this whole scene mattered more than a backyard complaint. That was the first moment I realized the fence itself wasn't the real issue. And by the time the rain finally started coming down hard enough to empty the barbecue tables, things had already become much worse for Celeste Whitmore than she understood. By Monday morning, the entire neighborhood had picked a side without saying it out loud. You could feel it in the way conversations stopped when my truck rolled past the Marina Diner near Route 18. Blackwater Cove was one of those lake communities where everybody watched everybody through windows over coffee cups, and after the barbecue incident, people suddenly found the floor very interesting whenever I walked in. The old fisherman near the bait cooler nodded carefully, but did not linger. 2 women from Cedar Bluff Lane lowered their voices the second I grabbed a thermos refill near the counter. Rain hammered softly against the diner windows while fog drifted low over the lake outside, thick enough to blur the fishing docks into gray silhouettes. I sat alone in the back booth listening to silverware clink against ceramic plates and reread the notice Celeste had taped to my mailbox sometime before sunrise. Community Noncompliance Review. Formal hearing pending. 3 pages of polished language wrapped around one simple message. Fall in line, or we will make your life expensive. What bothered me was not the threat itself. It was the timing. The board moved too fast. Faster than most homeowners associations ever move unless money is already involved. That thought stayed with me all morning while cold rain rolled across the windshield of my truck on the drive to the county zoning office 20 miles north in Belmere. The courthouse square looked almost black under the storm clouds, water running down old limestone walls while pickup trucks lined the curb beside muddy construction trailers. Inside, the heating system rattled hard enough to sound like pipes knocking inside the walls. Mason Pike met me near the permit counter holding a stale donut and looking like he had not slept much in years. "You are Grant Holloway?" he asked quietly. I nodded once. He glanced around before lowering his voice. "You have become very popular around here." That was not a compliment. He slid my property file across the counter and tapped one page with his finger. "Your fence is legal," he said. "Actually more compliant than half the retaining walls in Blackwater Cove." I stared at him for a second. "Then why the hearing?" Mason exhaled slowly through his nose. "Because somebody keeps pushing emergency visibility complaints through the board." He hesitated before adding. "And because your property sits directly between the Ridge homes and the Western Lakeview corridor." There it was. The first real crack in the whole thing. Not aesthetics. Not neighborhood harmony. Views. Expensive views. I drove back toward the lake with that sentence bouncing around my head while thunder rolled over the water hard enough to shake the truck doors. Halfway home, Lydia called from Pittsburgh. My sister never wasted words. "Grant," she said immediately, "do not remove a single board from that fence." I pulled onto the shoulder beside the old marina access road while rain pounded the metal roof of the truck. "What did you find?" I asked. Papers shuffled on her end. Celeste Whitmore signed preliminary support letters for a refinancing package on the clubhouse expansion 6 months ago. The lender valuation depends on maintaining open shoreline visibility from the upper properties. I looked through the windshield toward the fog-covered water below the ridge, and suddenly the whole neighborhood started making sense. The pressure, the public performance, Trevor showing up with a hammer instead of lawyers. They were not trying to improve the community. They were trying to protect a financial deal before residents started asking questions. And judging by how fast things were escalating, I had a feeling that deal was already in trouble. The hearing notice spread through Blackwater Cove faster than a thunderstorm warning. By Wednesday evening, residents were standing in clusters near mailboxes pretending to talk about weather while watching my driveway out of the corners of their eyes. Even the lake looked tense that week. Wind pushed long gray ripples across the water hard enough to slam old fishing boats against their docks through the night, and every morning fog rolled thick over the shoreline like the whole neighborhood was trying to hide from something ugly moving underneath it. I barely slept. Around 4 in the morning, I would end up sitting at the kitchen table with stale coffee listening to rain tap against the metal porch roof while headlights swept occasionally across the cedar fence outside. Twice I caught slow-moving vehicles stopping near the property line before driving off again. Watching, measuring, waiting. The exhaustion started settling into my chest in a way I had not felt since my divorce 3 years earlier, back when silence inside a house could feel heavier than shouting. That fence was never just lumber to me. After Melissa left and the stalking mess with her former client happened, privacy stopped feeling optional. The backyard became the only place in my life that still felt quiet. That was the part Celeste did not understand. Or maybe she understood perfectly and simply did not care. Thursday night, the social pressure escalated again. Someone posted drone photos of my property in the HOA Facebook group with the caption "community" or "compound." By dinner, the comments had turned vicious. People complained about blocked sunsets, declining aesthetics, property anxiety. One resident called the fence emotionally aggressive, which honestly sounded insane even for Blackwater Cove. But mixed into all the outrage were cracks. Small ones. A few homeowners started asking why the board was spending emergency legal funds over one compliant structure, while storm drainage repairs near the marina still had not been completed. Those comments disappeared within an hour. Deleted. That caught my attention more than the insults did. Friday afternoon, I drove down to the marina store for ice and diesel additive before another storm rolled in. The place went dead quiet when I walked through the door. You could hear rainwater dripping off jackets onto the old wood floor near the bait fridge. Russ Nolan stood near the coffee machine staring into a styrofoam cup like he regretted being there. Russ had lived in Blackwater Cove longer than almost anybody. Former contractor. Divorced twice. The kind of guy who noticed everything and trusted nobody. He waited until the cashier walked into the back before speaking. "You know why she is panicking, right?" he asked quietly without looking at me. I set the ice on the counter. "I know enough." Russ shook his head slowly. "No. You know the surface." Outside, thunder rolled hard enough to rattle the windows. He leaned closer. "That clubhouse project is upside down financially. The board borrowed against next year's reserve funds already. If property values dip or refinancing fails, half this neighborhood gets hit with special assessments." I felt something shift in that moment. Not fear exactly. Clarity. Celeste was not protecting community standards. She was protecting leverage over people already financially trapped. Russ glanced toward the parking lot where Trevor's truck had just pulled in, spraying muddy water across the gravel. "You did not hear this from me," he muttered. "But there are board members starting to realize she may have lied to them." Trevor stepped out wearing that same smug half grin from the barbecue. But this time, he was carrying rolled architectural renderings under one arm. He stopped cold when he saw me standing beside Russ. For the first time since this started, the confidence in his face flickered. Just for a second. Then he covered it with a smile and said, "Big week coming, Grant." I looked at the blueprints in his hands and answered calmly. "For who?" He did not reply. He just walked toward the back office while rain hammered harder against the roof, and somewhere out over the lake a warning siren began echoing through the fog. The hearing happened the following Monday under weather that felt personal. Cold rain hammered Blackwater Cove from before sunrise, turning the gravel parking area outside the clubhouse into thick brown mud, where pickup trucks sat coated in lake grit and runoff. Wind rolled hard off the water, rattling the marina flagpoles and bending the pine trees along the shoreline until branches scraped across rooftops with slow groaning sounds that kept setting people on edge. By the time I walked into the clubhouse community room carrying my coffee thermos, the place already smelled like damp coats, burnt coffee, and nervousness. Residents filled nearly every folding chair. Some avoided eye contact the second they saw me. Others stared openly now, curiosity starting to overpower caution. That was new. The silence shifted when Celeste entered. She wore a cream-colored blazer like she was arriving for a campaign event instead of a neighborhood hearing, clipboard tucked against one arm, smile polished so carefully it almost looked painful. Trevor followed, carrying those same rolled architectural drawings from the marina store. The second he placed them on the front table, I saw 3 board members exchange uneasy looks. Small moment. Important moment. Celeste noticed it too. Her smile tightened almost invisibly. "Let us begin," she said smoothly, tapping the microphone even though the room barely needed amplification. "Tonight is about preserving the character and future of Blackwater Cove. Not preserving legality. Not preserving rules. Future." Interesting choice of word. Rain battered the clubhouse windows while she launched into a presentation filled with phrases like community harmony, aesthetic continuity, and market confidence. Every sentence sounded professionally rehearsed, but underneath it I could hear strain creeping in. Pressure. Then Trevor unrolled the renderings across the table. Luxury hillside terraces. Expanded marina decks. A redesigned clubhouse with floor-to-ceiling western lake views directly through the section where my property sat. The room went quiet in a different way this time. Not fear. Recognition. Several residents clearly had never seen these plans before. One older man near the back muttered, "What the hell is this?" Celeste pivoted instantly. "Preliminary concepts only," she said with a soft laugh. Nothing finalized. But the damage had already started. I watched board member Diane Mercer slowly lower her glasses while staring at the drawings like she had just realized she had signed documents she never fully read. That was the first crack happening publicly instead of behind closed doors. Celeste saw me watching and shifted gears immediately. "Mr. Holloway," she said warmly, using the tone people reserve for difficult children. "Surely you understand that private preferences cannot supersede collective investment." There it was again. Investment. I stood slowly, hearing the chair legs scrape against the floor loud enough to echo. My heartbeat surprised me. Not panic. Anger. Deep and old and tired. The kind that builds when people with money decide your home matters less than their projections. My fence passed every county inspection, I said calmly. Your own zoning consultant confirmed that last week. Trevor straightened immediately. Celeste did not. Compliance, she replied softly, does not always equal cooperation. A few people nodded automatically. Then Russ Nolan spoke from the back without standing up. Did cooperation include borrowing against reserve funds for this project? The room froze. You could actually hear rainwater dripping from somebody's jacket onto the clubhouse floor. Celeste turned toward him slowly. Excuse me. Russ leaned back in his chair. People deserve to know what kind of debt this board already signed them up for. Suddenly, everyone started talking at once. Questions. Confusion. Somebody demanded to know why residents never voted on expansion financing. Another asked whether HOA dues were going up again. Diane Mercer looked physically ill. Trevor stepped toward Russ like he wanted to shut the conversation down. But this was no longer about my fence. The room had shifted underneath Celeste's feet, and for the first time since this started, she looked genuinely cornered. The storm finally broke sometime after midnight, but Blackwater Cove did not calm down with it. If anything, the neighborhood felt meaner once the rain stopped. Fog hung low over the lake the next morning, thick enough that the fishing docks looked like shadows floating in empty space, and every conversation around the marina carried that sharp edge people get when they realize money might be involved. By sunrise, the hearing fallout had already spread across every neighborhood group chat and porch conversation in the community. Residents who spent years nodding quietly through HOA meetings suddenly wanted explanations. Questions about reserve funds, refinancing debt, and hidden expansion plans hit the board inbox hard enough that Diane Mercer resigned from the finance committee before noon. That shook people. Diane had lived there 14 years and avoided drama like it carried disease. If she was backing away publicly, residents assumed something serious was buried underneath the paperwork. Celeste tried to regain control fast. Around 10 in the morning, she posted a long statement blaming misinformation, hostility, and disruptive residents for creating unnecessary panic. She never mentioned my name directly, but she did not need to. Everyone knew exactly who she meant. What surprised me was how differently people reacted this time. The comments did not immediately fall in line anymore. Some residents defended her, sure, but others started pushing back openly. One woman asked why the board approved conceptual marina expansions without a community vote. Another demanded to know whether special assessments were coming. The post disappeared within 30 minutes. By then, screenshots were already circulating. That afternoon, I drove into Belmere for lumber sealant and ended up parked outside the county records annex during another burst of cold rain. I sat there longer than I should have with the engine running and windshield wipers knocking steadily back and forth while exhaustion settled deeper into me. There is a point in these kinds of fights where you realize your home has stopped feeling like home. Every truck slowing near your driveway feels intentional. Every silence feels loaded. I hated that feeling. Hated what it was turning me into. Then Lydia called again. Grant, she said carefully. There is something else. I could hear courthouse noise behind her. Phones ringing and footsteps echoing across tile floors. The lender attached environmental conditions to the refinancing package. I frowned. What kind of conditions? Papers shuffled softly. Wind mitigation exposure. Shoreline stabilization. Structural protection for the Western Ridge properties. I stared through the rain toward the lake road below the annex parking lot. Suddenly, pieces that never fit before started locking together. The Ridge home sat exposed during winter storms. Hard lake wind came straight across open water and slammed into that side of the neighborhood every year. Insurance complaints had been piling up for months. Celeste was not just chasing luxury views anymore. She was trying to protect property valuations before the lenders reevaluated risk exposure. And my cedar fence sat directly across one of the worst wind corridors on the ridge. I drove home slowly through fog so thick the headlights barely cut through it. When I turned onto my gravel driveway, I stopped cold. Someone had spray painted the outside of the fence overnight. Community First in giant white letters stretching across 3 cedar panels. Fresh paint still dripped down into the wet gravel below. Several residents stood farther down the road pretending to check mail while watching my reaction. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The humiliation was the point. Public pressure. Isolation. Make the difficult homeowner look unstable until he folds. For a few seconds, I just stood there in the cold wind listening to water drip from the cedar branches overhead. Then something inside me shifted quietly into place. Not anger anymore. Strategy. I walked into the garage, pulled open an old steel cabinet, and took out the business card Mason Pike had slipped into my property file folder 3 days earlier. Coastal Structural Dynamics. Wind Mitigation Specialists. Under the company name, somebody had handwritten one sentence in blue ink. If the board wants a barrier issue solved legally, solve it permanently. The next week changed the rhythm of everything in Blackwater Cove. People stopped treating the situation like gossip and started treating it like weather, something heavy moving toward the neighborhood, whether they wanted to acknowledge it or not. Fog rolled across the lake almost every morning now, thick cold sheets drifting between docks and shoreline pines while the wind came hard off the water strong enough to shake porch furniture across the ridge homes after sunset. Insurance adjusters had started appearing quietly around the neighborhood too. Unmarked SUVs. Men with clipboards walking seawalls. Residents noticed. Residents always notice when outsiders start inspecting expensive property. I kept my head down publicly after the paint incident, which confused Celeste more than if I had exploded. No angry posts. No legal threats. No neighborhood arguments. I pressure washed the fence clean before sunrise one morning while cold mist drifted through the cedar trees and left the gravel driveway slick beneath my boots. Then I started making calls. Coastal Structural Dynamics sent 2 engineers 3 days later. One former Army infrastructure consultant named Ellis Mercer and a younger woman named Paige Rollins who spoke with the calm precision of somebody used to explaining million-dollar risks to nervous developers. They walked the ridgeline behind my property for almost 2 hours while lake wind hammered their jackets and waves slapped hard against the muddy shoreline below. Ellis finally stopped near the western corner of my fence and stared across the open water toward the marina inlet. "That is your corridor problem right there," he said. "Straight winter crosswinds. No natural break." Paige crouched beside one of the cedar posts taking measurements. "You realize this neighborhood was built backwards?" she asked quietly. "These ridge homes should have had structural mitigation installed years ago." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it surprised me anymore, but because it confirmed something deeper. Celeste and the board had known about the exposure risks long before my fence became controversial. They just wanted somebody else to absorb the solution. By Friday afternoon, the engineers returned with preliminary recommendations. Reinforced transparent wind mitigation installation. Ballistic-rated laminated structural glass. 60 feet high at peak elevation due to ridge pressure calculations. The estimated cost made me stare at the paperwork for a full minute in silence while rain hammered the garage roof overhead. It was insane. Massive. The kind of project that would instantly become the most talked about structure anywhere near the lake. Lydia read the proposal over speakerphone while I stood at the workbench smelling wet cedar and motor oil. "Grant," she said carefully, "if this gets approved through environmental stabilization permitting, the HOA cannot classify it as decorative fencing." There it was. The opening. Not revenge. Leverage. I filed the preliminary permit package the following Monday through county infrastructure review instead of residential zoning. Exactly the way Ellis recommended. That mattered. Residential disputes could be manipulated locally. Infrastructure liability reviews triggered county oversight automatically. Different department. Different standards. Different people. Celeste did not realize any of this at first. She was too busy trying to contain fallout inside the neighborhood. Residents had begun openly questioning board spending now. Somebody leaked portions of the refinancing proposal online, and by midweek rumors about special assessments spread through Blackwater Cove like floodwater. People who once avoided me suddenly slowed near my driveway pretending to admire the lake while asking careful questions about the hearing. One older resident quietly admitted her insurance premiums had already increased 30% over shoreline exposure concerns. Another asked whether the board had structural reports from homeowners. The social tide was turning slowly, unevenly, but turning all the same. Then Thursday evening, Celeste finally showed up at my property alone. No Trevor. No clipboard. Just her white SUV crunching slowly up the wet gravel driveway under a sky dark enough to look bruised. She stepped out holding an umbrella against the wind and stared at the clean cedar fence for several seconds before speaking. "You are creating panic," she said softly. I stayed beside the garage doorway with my coffee thermos in one hand. No, I answered calmly. I think panic was already here. Her jaw tightened slightly. Emotional crack. Small but real. This neighborhood survives on stability, she said. People trusted us. I looked past her toward the ridge homes glowing faintly through lake fog and answered in the same quiet tone. Then maybe somebody should have told them the truth before the county got involved. That landed harder than I expected. Celeste went completely still for one long second while rain ticked softly against her umbrella. Then her eyes shifted toward the permit envelope sitting on my workbench inside the garage. And for the first time since this began, I watched genuine fear enter her expression. Word spread about the county permit filing before the county even finished reviewing it. That was the thing about Blackwater Cove. News moved across the lake faster than weather. By the following Tuesday, people were standing in little clusters near the marina coffee counter whispering over printed screenshots of permit classifications they barely understood. Wind mitigation infrastructure, structural shoreline stabilization, ballistic laminated barrier system. The phrases sounded expensive and frightening enough that residents immediately started imagining worst-case scenarios. Some blamed me. More blamed the board. The silence around Celeste had changed completely now. A month earlier, people leaned toward her when she entered a room. Now conversations paused awkwardly instead. Neighbors studied their phones, avoided eye contact, moved carefully around her like she carried liability exposure in her purse. I noticed it most at the diner near Belmere Highway where half the community gathered every morning after sunrise. Rain tapped steadily against the windows while lake fog drifted low across the parking lot outside, swallowing pickup trucks almost to the wheel wells. Celeste walked in wearing another crisp blazer and carrying herself with that same controlled posture, but nobody invited her into conversation anymore. One couple physically lowered their voices when she approached. Another resident quietly gathered his coffee and moved booths entirely. The social authority she spent years building was starting to rot in public. She felt it too. You could see it in the way her smile arrived half a second too late now. Around noon, the first county survey crews appeared near the ridge line behind my property. Bright orange markers, measuring equipment, utility flags pushed into wet ground while residents watched nervously from porches under blankets and rain jackets. Trevor tried to frame it as intimidation. "This is getting ridiculous," he snapped loudly near the marina fuel station while several homeowners listened nearby. "Grant is turning the neighborhood into a military zone." Nobody answered him. That silence hit harder than any argument could have. Russ Nolan finally broke it by asking one quiet question. "Then why did the county approve preliminary review?" Trevor had no response for that. He just walked away angry while people watched him leave instead of defending him. That was new too. By Thursday afternoon, the emotional pressure inside the community had become impossible to hide. Rumors about reserve fund exposure spread beyond Blackwater Cove into neighboring lake developments. Realtors started calling homeowners asking whether the refinancing controversy would impact shoreline values. One board member resigned completely. Another publicly requested an independent audit. Every hour the social damage widened. Meanwhile, I stayed almost invisible. I worked quietly in the garage through cold mornings while rain drummed against the roof and wind shook the cedar trees hard enough to scatter branches across the driveway. I reviewed engineering drafts, signed environmental review forms, spoke carefully with county infrastructure contacts. The calmer I became, the more unstable Celeste looked by comparison. That contrast mattered. People trust composure during financial panic. Friday evening, she confronted me again, this time outside the mailbox cluster near the Marina Road while fog rolled thick across the lake behind us. Several residents lingered nearby, pretending not to watch. Celeste stepped closer and lowered her voice. "You are humiliating this community. Not yourself. Not the board. The community." I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No," I said quietly. "I think the community just realized who has been humiliating them." The expression on her face shifted instantly. Hurt first, then anger, then something worse. Isolation. Because the residents standing 20 feet away heard every word and not one of them stepped forward to defend her. The county arrived on a gray Thursday morning under weather that made the whole lake feel like it was holding its breath. Fog pressed low against the shoreline so heavily that the ridge homes looked half submerged in cloud. and cold wind came hard across the water, carrying the smell of wet cedar, diesel fuel, and rain-soaked earth. I was standing in the garage reviewing revised engineering elevations when 3 county vehicles rolled slowly into Blackwater Cove one after another. Not zoning trucks this time. County infrastructure enforcement. Sheriff Department utility support. Residents noticed immediately. Curtains shifted. Front doors opened. By the time the vehicles stopped near the clubhouse, people were already gathering under umbrellas along the Marina Road, pretending they were simply curious. Nobody believed that anymore. The emergency HOA meeting had been called overnight after 2 lenders requested clarification on environmental exposure liabilities connected to the refinancing package. That sentence alone spread panic through the neighborhood. Nobody talks about lenders unless money is already bleeding somewhere. I walked toward the clubhouse through damp gravel while rain tapped steadily against dock roofs below the hill. Sheriff deputies stood quietly near the entrance, speaking with county investigators carrying thick folders under waterproof sleeves. The atmosphere inside felt completely different from previous meetings. No polished confidence. No staged authority. Residents sat stiff and silent while thunder rolled faintly over the lake outside. Celeste stood near the front table, shuffling papers too quickly, smile gone entirely now. Trevor looked exhausted for the first time since I met him. One deputy finally stepped forward and addressed the room in a calm, professional tone. "This is not a criminal proceeding," he said. "County Infrastructure Review requested attendance due to emerging liability concerns involving shoreline stabilization disclosures and board financial representations." The second he said representations, half the room turned toward Celeste. People hear words like that and immediately think somebody lied. Because usually somebody did. Celeste tried to regain control fast. "This review is procedural," she said sharply. "The board has cooperated fully." Then County Investigator Harold Bennett opened a folder and calmly replied, "Mrs. Whitmore, preliminary findings indicate the board may have approved refinancing submissions before structural exposure evaluations were finalized." Silence. Real silence this time. Even the air conditioning sounded loud. Diane Mercer stared straight ahead, like she wanted the floor to open beneath her chair. A resident near the back muttered, "Oh my God." Another demanded to know whether homeowners were now financially exposed. Questions started flying across the room faster than Celeste could contain them. Insurance liability, reserve borrowing, hidden engineering reports, deferred shoreline mitigation. Trevor attempted to interrupt twice before a sheriff deputy quietly told him to sit down. That moment changed everything socially. For years, Trevor moved through the neighborhood like authority protected him automatically. Watching uniformed deputies shut him down in front of the entire community hit people hard. The power balance shifted visibly inside the room. Then Harold Bennett turned another page and looked directly toward me. "Mr. Holloway's infrastructure filing," he said carefully, "appears to be the first fully compliant mitigation proposal submitted to the county regarding this exposure corridor." You could actually feel the emotional whiplash ripple through the residents. 3 weeks earlier, I was the selfish homeowner ruining the neighborhood. Now county investigators were openly acknowledging that my property might be the only legally structured solution currently on record. Celeste looked at me then with an expression I had not seen before. Not anger, not arrogance, collapse. Because she finally understood the worst part. The county was no longer reacting to her narrative. They were operating inside mine. Construction started 2 weeks later under the kind of cold gray weather that makes lake towns feel suspended between seasons. Massive flatbed trucks rolled into Blackwater Cove before sunrise, carrying reinforced glass panels wrapped in steel framing, while residents stood silently on porches holding coffee mugs and blankets against the wind. Nobody complained anymore. That was over. The mood now was something stranger. Curiosity mixed with embarrassment. The county approved the stabilization installation under Emergency Infrastructure Mitigation Review after insurance investigators confirmed the ridge exposure risks were substantially worse than previously disclosed by the board. Once that happened, everything accelerated. Sheriff deputies monitored traffic control near the marina entrance while cranes lifted 60-foot transparent panels in a place along the ridgeline behind my property. The structure looked unreal rising through fog over the lake, tall enough to catch pale morning light and reflect the shoreline back across the water like another world standing upright behind the cedar trees. Residents gathered every evening to watch construction finish in near silence. Even Trevor stopped talking. He mostly stayed inside after county investigators requested additional financial disclosures from the board. Rumors spread that lenders froze portions of the refinancing package pending independent review. Celeste disappeared completely for almost a week. Then came the first storm after installation. Hard winter wind tore across Blackwater Lake overnight with enough force to rip loose dock covers and knock branches across marina roads. But the ridge homes behind my property barely felt it. The new barrier broke the entire wind corridor exactly the way Ellis Mercer predicted. Debris damage dropped immediately. Noise levels fell. Insurance adjusters returned within days and quietly began reassessing shoreline exposure classifications throughout Blackwater Cove. That was when the final humiliation landed. The HOA received formal notice that removing or interfering with the mitigation structure could trigger liability escalation and premium increases across multiple insured properties. In plain English, the wall Celeste spent months trying to destroy had become one of the only things protecting the financial stability of the neighborhood she nearly wrecked. The emergency board meeting after that notice lasted less than 40 minutes. Nobody argued anymore. Residents sat exhausted beneath fluorescent lights listening to rain tick softly against the clubhouse windows while fog swallowed the marina outside. Diane Mercer attended only to officially support suspension of all prior enforcement actions connected to my property. Another board member resigned before the vote even finished. Then Celeste stood slowly from her chair holding a prepared statement with trembling hands. She looked older suddenly. Smaller. The board recommends entering a maintenance and access agreement regarding the mitigation structure, she said quietly without looking at me. Nobody reacted, not even Trevor. The silence in that room felt heavier than any shouting match we ever had. I signed the agreement 3 days later inside the county administration office while rain rolled steadily across the courthouse windows. The HOA would contribute annual maintenance fees for environmental protection access and emergency shoreline servicing rights connected to the barrier corridor. Completely legal. Completely public. The irony settled over Blackwater Cove like fog after a storm. The same people who mocked my fence now depended on the structure behind it to protect their homes, their insurance rates, and their property values. A month later, I finally reopened the garage fully for the first time since all this began. The cedar smell had returned after weeks of rain and cold wind. My old workbench sat exactly where it always had beneath the hanging lights, tools lined carefully against the wall, while lake fog drifted quietly beyond the glass barrier in the distance. One evening, Russ Nolan stopped by carrying 2 coffees from the marina diner. We stood in silence for a while listening to rain tap softly against the metal roof. Then he looked out toward the shoreline and shook his head slowly. Funny thing, he muttered. People spent years thinking power looked like control. I stared through the open garage toward the calm water beyond the ridge lights and answered quietly. Most of the time it just looks like surviving long enough for the truth to arrive. After everything collapsed, Blackwater Cove grew quieter. Residents waved again. Conversations returned. The gossip faded. But sometimes late at night, when heavy fog rolled across the lake and the barrier lights reflected faintly through the mist, I would still think about how close that neighborhood came to destroying itself over greed disguised as community. And every now and then, usually during storms, I would notice Celeste's white SUV parked alone near the marina overlook staring up at the wall she accidentally built for me.